Hi, and welcome to your Craft Box episode about 1984 and how to introduce a character in a way that feels like we get a very strong visual of them and also get a sense of how they speak and talk. So one of my favorite characters in 1984, Tom Parsons, and he's introduced to us officially, although we get a sense or a smell of what he's like prior to this, at the lunch counter when our main character Winston and his friend Simey are discussing their work. So it begins with Simey saying, "Here comes Parson." And we get this beautiful description that I'm really going to focus in on so we can understand exactly how skillful Orwell is and how skillful we can become by imitating him. So it says, Parsons, Winston's fellow tenant at Victory Mansions, was in fact threading his way across the room. So you can see there's like a visual component of this. They're in the middle of talking. Winston looks up. He looks across the room, having had Simey say, "Here he's coming," and he's watching him cross the room. So as he watches him cross the room, he has an opportunity to comment on his appearance. You see this all the time. This is actually how human beings take in sensory information. They see someone walking, they're looking at what they look like, they don't actually think about their face until the end. So when they get a little closer, so you're going to see that kind of sequence happening here. He says, "A tubby, middle-sized man with fair hair and a frog-like face. At 35, he was already putting on rolls of fat at neck and waistline, but his movements were brisk and boyish. His whole appearance was that of a little boy grown large, so much so that although he was wearing the regulation overalls, it was almost impossible not to think of him as being dressed in blue shorts and a gray shirt and a red neckerchief of the spies. In visualizing him, one saw always a picture of dimpled knees and sleeves rolled back from pudgy forearms. Parsons did, indeed, invariably revert to shorts when a community hike or any other physical activity gave him an excuse for doing so." So we get a sense of what he actually looks like with his frog-like face and how he's putting on rolls of fat. But then we also get a sense of how what Winston thinks of when he sees Parsons. He thinks of a little boy. He thinks of the little boy's uniform and the dimpled knees. We're not actually seeing his dimpled knees, but that's just something that Winston can't help but think of. And I think this is very common when you're taking in someone's appearance. You describe what they look like, and then you also describe what the person who's observing them begins to think of when they see that person. So this is a really complex move he's making. And now he's going to tell us what he sounds like now that he's close enough for them to hear him. He greeted them both with a cheery "hello, hello," and sat down at the table, giving off an intense smell of sweat. This should remind us of the smell of sweat that that Winston smelled back at his apartment earlier. Beads of moisture stood out all over his pink face. His powers of sweating were extraordinary. At the community center, you could always tell when he had been playing table tennis by the dampness of the bat handle. So there's this way in which he leaves in his wake always this sweatiness. And this kind of begins to also remind us again of the kind of primal or animal qualities we were introduced with him before when we saw where he lived, and it said it looked like some large animal had been let loose in there. So he's leaving a scent everywhere, kind of like an animal does. And he, very quickly we get this move to how Winston remembers he picked up this table tennis bat and felt it damp from him in some previous experience. Simey had produced a strip of paper on which there was a long column of words and was studying it with an ink pencil between his fingers. "Look at him working away at the lunch hour," said Parsons, nudging Winston. "Keenness, eh? What's that you've got there, old boy?" And so right away, Parsons also has a specific way of speaking. He says, "hello, hello." He says, keenness. He describes the word keenness to sort of compliment a lot of people on their loyalty to the party, their hard work to the party. And he also says old boy quite a bit. So these things kind of give him this overall impression of a kind of animalistic, overgrown child who feels like he's in some kind of boys' club, even though Simon and Winston clearly don't feel like he's a part of their club. So it's a beautiful, very brief and powerful, dense piece of writing that shows us how Orwell describes people as they approach, brings us into it, or the main character Winston's own head, thinking about the person, and then brings us back to the scene and we hear the character speaking. So it really does feel as though we're experiencing this world and these characters as Winston is. So that's the Craftbox moment on Tom Parsons and characterization. Hope you find it helpful, and good luck trying to write like Orwell.